Oh boy. All right.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Legal Contract and Board Policy meeting this evening of this December the 7th of 2020 COVID. We'll go ahead and start the meeting. Do we have any questions on any of the meeting notes that we had from last meeting?
No comments from me.
Okay. All right, if we had none, we'll move on with the agenda. We'll go ahead and start with the racial equity policy. Dr. James?
Yes,
Dr.
so I believe there were some changes. I think Dr. Akbar may want to talk about those.
Yes, so from our last meeting, we discussed making a few edits, as well as discussing in this meeting in more full a few other parts that we didn't get to. So one of the things that we discussed was adding information on student discipline. And then we had Deb Folk here at the last meeting and Kathy McVeigh to talk about the hiring and recruitment portions and comments about there being some classifications that might be exempt from one of the pieces. So what I did was took that feedback and just made that modification based off our discussion. So if you look at
and what I can do, Dr. Akbar, is I can share my screen and I'll put it up. And I think this will have, I think this one will be the one with your changes or highlights.
Yes.
So let me.
I basically just went to the last document that we had and just renamed it so you could see that it was updated.
Okay. Can you all see what I'm projecting?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
But I can't read it, but we can see it.
Is there any way to make it a little bit bigger?
Maybe a little bit larger.
Well, actually, I could read it, but I know we got some old folks on the phone.
That's right.
Watch out.
Hey, I'm younger than all of y'all, and I couldn't see it. So,
so if you'll look, this on my computer, it's kind of fuchsia color. These, I believe, Dr. Akbar, are the changes that you most recently made.
Yeah.
So the creation of the equity committee is going to be covered under another bylaw later in the agenda. So I understand why that one was crossed out.
Well, I didn't cross it out completely. It is under, if you scroll up, I can't remember which section. It was under ensuring systemic equity, I think. It was under the wrong section. I can't remember which one. Oh, it was under eliminating systemic disparities, and I moved it to under ensuring systemic equity is what I think I did. But it's that's what I did.
Okay.
But again, it was I also commented on the other policy as well.
Got it.
There. So there's congruency between the two.
Okay. And then I think the next one was where you included the equity and student discipline.
Yes. Again, thank you to, oh man, who was that? I can't even remember now. Josh, yes, Josh, for that discussion around student discipline. So what I did was I looked at the research and 3 other policies, and I combined that. So there was, I think, 3 different policies in the nation that I utilize their racial equity policies and their equity policies on that section on race, specifically with student discipline, and created these, I think, 3 paragraphs from that. based on what made the most sense.
Can I ask a related question, Dr. Akbar or this committee?
Oh, I guess it's more than 3 paragraphs, but yeah.
Gotcha. Can you
Yeah,
guys hear
what's
me
the-
okay?
Yeah,
Yep.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm having internet issues. Am I on delay or can you guys hear me in real time?
I can hear
No,
you
we
well.
can hear you.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay.
Fine.
Okay, gotcha. Thanks. So I just had 2 questions, and if you've already sort of discussed this already, then that's fair. I just wanted to ask them. The first question is have we, just from a naming of the committee standpoint, was there a conversation around naming it, calling it diversity, the diversity, equity, and inclusion committee as opposed to just equity? Did you guys talk through that? And then my other question was going to be, I see that equity and student discipline. I'd like to raise the opportunity to discuss, or at least sort of get on the burner somewhere, whether it be back burner or not, looking at data around equity and grading. So I think the equity and discipline is a very important first step. But I do think that equity and grading is, if discipline is the first step, then I think the equity and grading for me feels like a second sort of second or a third logical step. And there have been some presentations that have been done on this in national school board conferences in the last couple of years. That we could kind of pull from or pull experts if we're looking for feedback. But I just wanted to raise those two questions for this committee.
Yeah, and Dr. Hall, I think on the latter two with the grading, that would probably go into the equity policy, which we will need to go back and review the equity policy sometime this coming year and make amendments and adjustments to that, because that grading should probably be in the equity and not in the racial equity piece. Although you could also fight and say that it may need to be in the racial equity, because as you said, on some of the national levels, they have talked about this grading in equity and equitable types of grading, but I think it's more or less into the equity policy. And what was the first question again?
Yeah, Mr. Alexander, I was just curious about so the actual name of the committee. So it's called the Equity Committee. I saw in the bylaws when I was looking at it before this committee. I was just wondering, is there any merit in perhaps going with the name? So rather than calling it the Equity Committee, calling it the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee.
Yeah, I appreciate your question on that. I'll just say the reason why I lean towards equity committee instead of DEI, and this is someone who does DEI work all the time, but I'll tell you, in systems, when we mask equity in between other entities, equity tends to be the thing that we fall short on. And so putting equity up front, you can do the other things, but in addition to it, but we will do ourselves a disservice if we don't focus on equity specifically.
Gotcha.
And we should, I agree with Dr. Akbar on that, because even when we go back to the equity policy, it has inclusion in there as well, and diversity, and we need to go back and refine tune that. But that was the first part, because that was wordsmith from what we brought to the district when we first came up with equity, and we went into equity, diversity, and inclusion, and we said, okay, and we got that passed, but we still need to go back into that and refine that as well. So you guys, when you look at that equity policy, you'll see that we may need to do some changes, because it should be more equity involved in that versus the inclusion and the diversity, which also is part of it, but it was more or less equity for all kids in the district, as well as everything else that deals with equity.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
At the risk of oversimplifying anything, because this is anything but simple, right? It seems that if you get the equity piece in place and are really working toward that, then those other two areas would naturally fall into place.
Yeah. And you're right, Val. I mean, Mrs. McKentry, because actually, and when we first brought this here, I wanted equity, because when we talk about equity is a little more easier to take. Okay, but when you start really talking about equity, you get into, You start peeling back the layers, you start dealing with what we're talking about now in the racial equity policy. You start dealing about hard conversations on other areas. And so this was just a soft blow that started. And then now is a good time because all the things that are going on across the country with race and all the different things. This is a perfect time to bring this up front. And then as we move forward, we'll need to pull back some more layers, and there'll be some other areas that we may need to address as well. So this is the beginning. But I appreciate what you're saying, Dr. Hall, and I think that's a good question.
Yeah, no, listen, and I appreciate your responses on it. That makes sense to me. The reason why I mentioned, going back, I said the reason why I mentioned the equity and grading piece was because I saw that in this document that's being shared by Dr. James that there's a looks like there's a separate heading that says sort of equity and student discipline. That's why I didn't know if we would go for a heading that said equity and student grading, because I do think that's something that is a big enough deal that should be teased out as being independent of equity and student discipline. I think equity and grading, is worthy of its own call out. So those are just a couple of thoughts from the peanut gallery on that. But going back to so thank you for your response on that. The question I had about the equity and student discipline, and this may be opening a can, but I just want to at least ask the question: How do changes in this or implementing equity and inclusion, how does that have or would that have an impact on code of conduct? Does it impact any contractual language that we have with the AEA or any existing MOUs? I know the I Promise School has a separate arrangement around discipline, as I recall. So I just want to ask, how does this fit with in the existing landscape, if you will, of pre-existing sort of policy and procedure, at least as relates to student discipline and conduct?
Dr. Hall, there are three main policies: policy 5500, policy 5600, and policy 5610, which all deal with this issue. My recommendation would be that in the same with the grading policy, because we have policies that will cover grading, is that those policies be revised to reflect this language rather than having language put in here that may run contrary to those. You bring up a good point. We've always had, let's say, a contentious relationship on certain aspects of our discipline policy with primarily our teachers union. And, I'm not saying that's good or bad. That's just, we've had some healthy discussions about differences in how our code is applied and discipline regarding students. And there is language in our agreement with the Akron Education Association that covers some aspects of discipline. And they've gone back years, and we have had some disagreements about that.
Okay, great. Yeah, again, I just wanted to ask the question so that way it was sort of on the radar. I appreciate it. Thank you. So let me ask Dr. Akbar and Mr. Alexander. What are your thoughts on that? Do you gentlemen agree that it makes sense to revise existing language, or do you think, or do you find it more practical to go a different route or direction?
I think it depends on which and what. So I think we have the equity policy. If we all agree with the equity policy and the pieces around it, the racial equity policy, and then if there's any conflicts in the other policies, then subsequent to the passing of this policy, we immediately make those changes in the associated policies that Dr. James mentioned, would be my suggestion, because going to those policies, making changes before we know that we have board agreement, to me seems like that's a lot of work, especially since it centers on racial equity. Does that make sense?
Roger that. Yeah.
Yeah. And Derek, Dr. Hall, I think when we start talking about those grading policies, go back and look at those, and then we can go back and put some of this maybe language if we need to in there, or revise them and change them to so they will reflect what we're trying to talk about, or our goal, what goal we're trying to reach with those. Because I think we'd have to, again, like as Dr. Akbar said, we need to get this passed, and then we can go back and look at others. Just like I said, we need to go back and look at the equity policy again as well. So finishing this here policy, I think, would be more beneficial to us, and then going back to make those adjustments would be great. Just like Dr. James said, I think that would be the time there to go back, since we have 3 grading policies, and we need to go back and we just amend those and make those suggestions and so forth that you're thinking about and you're bringing up, which are good. And that's something I didn't think about, was the grading piece, and I've seen it too when we were at the conference, and they were talking about equity and grading, and I was in a couple of those sessions, and I thought, hey, this is interesting, but I didn't think of it. So I'm glad that you did think about that.
Great, thank you both. Appreciate it.
Okay. All right, Dr. James, I'm sorry. We can continue on. Dr. Akbar?
So anything else on the discipline section? You want to move on?
I'll just mention what the main crux of the student discipline portion is. It is basically requiring a adverse impact analysis biannually, or semi-annually, I'm sorry, with recommendations and resolutions from that data to come before the equity committee. So that's twice a year. It also is eliminating 2 practices that we may or may not be doing. One of them is, which I don't think we're doing, but it's just ensuring that we don't do it ever, which is to utilize school resource officers for disciplinary action and referrals for violations of the student code of conduct. So we should be dealing with violations of our student code within the district, not sending it to the police. So, that's the quickest way to develop that school to prison pipeline. The other piece is the eliminating of the disciplinary violations of disrespect and misbehavior. If you look at our state data, the vast majority of our disproportionality falls within those 2 categories. And when you ask, what does that mean? You get different answers. And so eliminating those 2 and being very clear, so actually calling for a review of our student code of conduct to clearly articulate and operationalize the other offenses and violations of the code. So ensuring that happens. And then the last thing has to do with that adverse impact analysis. So looking at the data in a disaggregated way to see it by school level, by teacher level, and by violation level, based off race and gender, as well as gender alone. So that is the crux of that portion. Any questions, comments, or concerns?
No concerns. I just had a clarifying question, if I may. To your point, Dr. Akbar, the disrespect and misbehavior thing have long, I think, it causes some consternation in my head as well. My clarifying question is, how do disrespect and misbehavior in general, like how does that differ from insubordination? In kind of within the context of a classroom or educate. I know in the work environment, I think we all know when it's subordination, that's pretty clearly spelled out. But are we going to see an uptick then in classifying student behavior as being insubordinate, as opposed to disrespectful or misbehavior? Again, for me, in my head, these things are a little bit cloudy and muddy, which is why I was just hoping for some clarification there.
Yeah, most of the issues around the disrespect in our code, it's a little different. Like it's many times it's a verbal assault, which could require a student to be removed from that building if it's directed at a staff member, and then have that student removed from that building because of a verbal assault. or physical assault. And then there's also, usually when we have issues, it'll be, instead of you saying, okay, you violated this code section, usually there'll be 2 or 3. So you were insubordinate because you didn't follow the staff member's, directive. And then if you happen to use a curse word, it could be a verbal assault and a whole variety of other code sections.
Gotcha. Thanks. I appreciate it. So basically what we would see here potentially is a migration of things that were disrespectful and misbehavior kind of falling into the insubordination category. Then is that fair?
It could, but we'll have to have conversations with some of our bargaining groups about that.
Okay,
Because they have one way of looking at it, and then we have another way of looking at it.
Yeah, and I will add to what Dr. James is saying. That's why a call for a review of the student code of conduct and actually clearly operationalizing the other violations. So to try to reduce that migration. Obviously, it is possible that migration still may happen. But if you're also on top of reviewing the code and getting it clearer, on top of that, you're also doing a semi-annual review of what violations are going, what violations are happening, and where they fall around any disproportionality found. Then we can begin to have those discussions as well. So you could do that on a consistent, ongoing basis. Then at present, I don't think. I'm sorry, I accidentally muted myself. Presently, I don't think the board gets that information that frequently.
So you're talking about the difference in, I guess it's an escalation process, right? So it might start as something, I don't know, some kind of disrespect or misbehavior. And then as it worsens, then it becomes insubordination, and maybe then it lumps a few other things in with that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's all for student discipline. The other piece that was modified was the recruitment, screening, hiring, and retention. Some of the language, well, actually, whole sections were struck out. And what I did was, based off the feedback, I didn't think that the whole sections needed to be struck out. I thought that it needed to be reworded a little bit to incorporate the comments and context that was added. And so that's what I did there. And basically, it's just about the screening process and having a values-based screening process. So eliminating values-based screening processes and basically giving the hiring managers more access to who's in the pool to make decisions for their buildings or administrative positions. And the hope is,
because whose values are they based on, right?
Yeah, they're based on white hegemonic values, actually.
Right. If it's a white middle class value system, then you're going to leave out a whole bunch of folks, right?
Definitely, and that's what happens whenever you create normative values or cultural assessments. The largest number of individuals in that population, meaning culture-wise or race-wise, their values tend to become normalized. So we're trying to respect everyone and honor everyone's cultural differences, and really give buildings who know what their students' needs are a little bit better than a screening process that's based on normative values. So there's still likelihood. There is still there's still potential for bias to creep in any way, but you begin to chip away at some of those processes that you know are biased. One thing that we could do, which is not added here, but one thing that we could add is an adverse impact analysis annually on our hiring, promotion, and our hiring and promotion processes, and maybe even pay processes. So if we do it for those 3 categories for every category of employee we have annually, that will give us, just like with student discipline, a more up close and personal look at that more regularly. And so that's something we can consider to add that I didn't add, but we could.
So quick question about that. Do we have, I guess related question maybe, is there anything like, and pardon the analogy, but in the NFL, they have what's called the Rooney Rule, right? Where for a head coaching position, you are required to interview one diverse candidate. And there are some exceptions to that, but do we have anything, or has anything like that been considered here as a possible replacement for some of the normative values-based screening processes? Have we thought about, or is it on the table that we'd have something like a Rooney Rule here?
Kathy's
And
not.
I'm just asking. If there's no need for it, that's fine. I just wanted to at least ask the question.
But I think we have done a better job of finding minority candidates particularly for our administrative positions. And I'm not saying it's easy, but the language here says we may need to look at something different, than those norm values-based screenings. So we might have to look at that.
Yeah, and the other, and I'm not sure that I fully agree with the Rooney Rule, because that makes it more numbers based. But I think what might be important here is if we look at collecting information. So one of the things that Kathy did share with us at the last meeting that I'm not sure how, I don't know the challenge with this, because every institution I know does this, but we need to be able to collect racial and gender and veteran status information when people apply, and make it optional, not mandatory, but that will give us some data about what the pool looks like. And so if the pool is diverse from that information, that gives the central HR an opportunity to say this pool is diverse, you can move forward. And if not, then they can figure out other ways to try to get a more diverse pool. A lot of entities, especially public entities, have that done by an affirmative action department. And I know we don't have one, and probably I'm not suggesting we get one, but some of those processes we should look to incorporate.
Yeah, and we have to look at also the way that we recruit, the recruitment measure. The way that we recruit is going to be a little more crucial, and we need to put more tentacles out there into places that have more minorities. And if you have those tentacles out there, you'll probably attract more and sell our district a little bit as far as marketing. And I think what will happen is that we will get more of those type of candidates who will be willing to want maybe to come to Akron and say, okay, yeah, I want to be part of the Akron Public School District because they're doing this and they're doing that. And I think once we do that, and then we change our recruiting, and we have to do more. We can't just do the kind of, I call it the local recruiting that we're going in Ohio and basically Ohio. We need to go outside because I know years ago there was program at the University of Akron where they recruited various individuals from, like the South, and they brought a lot of those individuals up to the University of Akron. A lot of them got into education, and there were a number of them that came to Akron Public Schools and worked, and they also continued to rise in our district, and some stayed and worked in the district in higher positions, and a few of them left. Actually, and one in particular is one of the current superintendent of Columbus Public Schools, who was Akron Public Schools. Was recruited through the University of Akron, and we worked with the University of Akron to get these students, and came here, and I mean, she's blossomed, but those are just kind of examples where I'm just trying to say that we need to look at.
It also might require us, even though it's not something that we're necessarily, I don't know that we've done, and it's not something that we have direct control over, but those employees that are hired via civil service, and we might need to see what advocacy we can make, and maybe what progress we can make in the civil service arena, because we do have a number of employees that those positions probably could be filled more diversely, but it might require us to take a look at how our civil service operates here locally. And we don't, like I said, I guess we don't have direct control over that, but it's something we should think about.
Yeah, that was one of the things that Kathy mentioned, and I know Deb mentioned it as well, and really gave a lot of robust context for that for Bruce and I, and whoever, I can't remember who all else was on that meeting, which is why we changed that a little bit. And because we don't have direct say, I think it's good to be something that Dr. James or even Kathy may want to look into, but I don't think that we should, move or get too wrapped up in that.
Yep. Okay. All right. We'll continue to move on. Anything else in this policy, Dr. Akbar, that we need to deal with?
Yeah, it was the resource distribution section at the finance and resource allocation. Actually, let's scroll up. Sorry. And Ryan's not here, but I'm okay with the strikeouts. I just wanted to know that we did not review that at all. I wanted to see what everyone's thoughts were on that.
And my thought is that, I know Ryan's not here, but I know he started doing some work on this area, and we probably could, we would benefit by hearing from him and seeing where he thinks we should kind of go with some of this as well. Hear some of his ideas of what he has in this area of finance and resource allocation, because I know he's been looking into this and doing this kind of some of his research for a little over a year, almost 2 years now, maybe even longer than that when we start talking about equity. And he's the first one who dived into this equity piece to say, okay, I need to look at the finances. Let's start looking at that and so forth. So I think we need to, let him weigh in.
Yeah. So yeah, I appreciate that too. I mean, so this is where I think sometimes the way our committees are set up kind of forces us to work in silos on things that really can be more cross-functional. So much of the College and Career Academy, there is that overlap at times between finance and intellectual policy. This is one where I think there's overlap between sort of legal policy, and it's going to be equity and obviously finance committee, right? I mean, so Ms. Autry, so I want to defer to Ms. Autry as well to have an opportunity to weigh in on this. But I know that we have added as a sort of a permanent standing agenda item within the finance committee to be talking about sort of all things equity and finance, right? Which also includes the equity in resource allocation. We're actually actively looking at some of that stuff now. But I would love to do whether this is quarterly or like every other month, but maybe this is a topic that we do a joint kind of committee meeting where we've got finance as well as legal policy and contracts, doing a joint meeting around this topic, because I would want, you, Dr. Akbar, and you, Mr. Alexander, to be able to kind of hear some of the conversation, kind of hear what we've been working on, and have a chance to opine as well on that. So just as, Ms. McKittrick and Ms. Mansfield, as we move forward, they can opine on things that are finance, and we can talk about things that are, so that's what I'm saying before. I think, as we sort of move forward, I think, in the new calendar year, it might make sense with respect to certain topics to prioritize maybe some joint, some joint operating committee, call them JOCs, joint operating committee meetings around certain topics.
I think that's perfectly fine. I will say, though, as we move to the committee policy, it may make more sense for the equity policy, equity committee and the finance committee to meet than the legal contracts and board policy.
Okay. Sure.
That could be, that could be something we talk downrange.
Downrange. I got you.
I would say, I just realized what I said, but I'm glad I said it to you because other people may not understand it. Military thing.
There's military stuff there.
Yeah, my bad. I don't know why my brain just went there. But yeah, so that was the only other piece. I think we had pretty much felt good about the other pieces, unless I am mistaken, Dr. James or Mr. Alexander.
I think that covers it.
So what I would ask if Dan Rambler and his team would look at the student discipline, that's the major, I would say probably the most updated or change, because that didn't exist before. I did utilize the feedback that Josh gave me from my notes about what they probably should look at. So I think it's incorporated and goes a little bit beyond what he shared. But yeah.
Yeah, I think we should let them look at that, because Josh did give some input. He came to us and said, hey, this is something he would like to look at. So they should have an opportunity to look at that and maybe give us some of their input as well. Okay. All right. Anything else with the racial equity?
I do have a question. I know we were aiming for December 14th for the third and final reading. What are your thoughts about where we are with that? Do you think Dan will have enough time?
I'll work with him to make sure they can review it, before the end of the week. And
okay.
That came from Josh. I wouldn't expect to see any major changes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, most of it didn't come from Josh, but it was in line with what he stated, and then we went a little bit beyond that. So.
All right.
Yeah. I don't want anybody to think that Josh went as far as I did.
All right, I'll have them review that.
Yeah. It was something else I was gonna say. No, I think that's it. Yeah. And then once Bruce, I'm sorry, Mr. Alexander, once we get that feedback back, that sounded weird. But once we get that feedback, we can decide if it's ready to go, and maybe get that clean version out to everybody.
Okay.
Yes, that'd be perfect.
Cool.
Okay. All right. Naming policy.
All right, here, let me get out of here. Close that one. And then I'll share my screen again. And we'll get to the naming policy. Let's see. There we go. And I'll can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know, Mr. Alexander looks like he's stressed to see that screen. I just want to make sure that you can see that.
When you get to be my age and you start wearing trifocals, you're gonna do the same thing.
You youngins need to show a little respect.
Hey, we're still young, Val. Don't let them tell us we're old. We're young.
If you say so.
Very simple policy, and it's the
Yeah.
board's discretion on how you want to have a facility named. And it would include parts of buildings. So it could be fields, auditoriums, stadiums, gyms, library, multi-purpose rooms, training rooms.
Yeah, I think it should include all those because you'll have individuals such as, what's going on now with Miss Jones, who passed, and
Yeah.
wanting to name floor, gym floor, or something after her. So I think that was something we would probably need to
Right.
put in there or consider.
So yeah, I think, I agree. I think this is pretty straightforward. I just wanted to ask. So this may be something that is already maybe a part of an admin guideline somewhere. But for example, when we're looking at, it may not need to be in a policy per se, but my question was going to be, when we are looking at naming a facility, room, et cetera, after an individual, do we employ someone to do a sort of robust sort of background check on that person? And I ask that question because there are times when, on the surface, you might believe a person, they've been an educator for 30 years and they're stand up and blah, blah, blah. And then you do a background check and then some things come out that no one ever really knew about that person that could raise an embarrassment should someone else find it and dig it out. So I just was curious about that. Was my first question.
So here, let me, I'll stop sharing this, and I did draft some administrative guidelines, and let me, I'm gonna pull those up so you can take a look, and we can then discuss that part.
Okay.
So these were, this is just draft. But as you can see, it just follows that board policies. And then it said, here's the criteria. All right. Because I know that was in one of the earlier versions of that policy. I felt it really belonged in administrative guidelines. So it would be, so we have number 1, 2, 3. All right. We could add language, regarding like some background information that what is, not detrimental or embarrassing to the reputation of, the Akron Public Schools or the legacy of, however we want to do that.
Roger that. Okay. No, yeah. Okay. That I appreciate that. Yeah. That was just the one kind of question I had was sort of around that.
Okay.
So, because again, I know a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, I know that there can be times when, someone on the service is a saint and then something comes up that, usually the context is domestic violence, like, oh, so-and-so was the great teacher and wrote that this person may have been abusive to their wife or children in some way that no one would have known, so that's why, I wanted to kind of,
And we'd rather do the research ahead of time than name something after someone and have to change it after something embarrassing comes out, right?
Right.
And so you guys know, the administrative guidelines are basically Dr. James and them kind of separated the policy piece, the meat from the guidelines. The guidelines were part of the policy, and so I think to me, I thought it was good. I like the way it was put together, and it gives a little better policy. Just gives it what the policy is. Now here's the guidelines and how we go about doing this when we do it. And so adding what Dr. Hall said, doing some research, I think is good because I agree. And as Ms. McKendrick says, we need to do the research beforehand before we allow something to name a floor or a gym or building or something after someone, then find out later that there was something that wouldn't be good for us and kind of hurt us in the long run.
And then another question too was with respect to naming of a facility, has the policy always, like historically, has the policy always been one where it was for the duration of the life of the facility, or in the past was it supposed to be something that was in perpetuity? And I asked the question obviously within the context of school buildings, right? I mean, so for example, when we built, I'm trying to think of so Bookto High School, so when Bookto High School was built, was there at that time, was understanding that if you tore down Bookto and rebuild it, it had to be called Bookto because of a rule where the name would be used in perpetuity if a building was to be located at that location?
No, that was never in any of our policies that I recall. And typically, when we were replacing our buildings and building them new, we pretty much kept the same name, except Highland Park, which is currently Sam Salem, but they changed the name before we even had these project. So Sam Salem is named after a former board member, of course.
Yeah, Dr. Hall, me neither. And I did some research around this it was actually when we got approached about a facility last year, and the process got pretty far out in front of us. Locally, within that neighborhood, the naming was announced before it ever came to the board, even though the board had said, hey, we're working on a new policy. We'd like to put this through our new policy as soon as we finish it. That the name ended up getting announced in the community and within the media before we even had a chance to look at it. So there hasn't been a really strong policy around this, both for the naming and for the duration, which is something we talked about last year, which was should, at least to protect ourselves at some point in the future, should we put in the policy that, hey, this is for, instead of in perpetuity, this is more of a, will be reviewed every, 20, 30, 25, 30 years, and give an opportunity, like let people know up front, this may not be in perpetuity if it's, if this building has been rebuilt 3 times since then, and, nobody can really tell you why it was named what it's named, maybe we give the community an opportunity to sort of update, but that's never been in the policies that I could find.
Gotcha. So 2 quick follow-up questions on this one. The one would be to that point, Mr. Bravo. Here, with looking at saying it would be for the duration of the useful life of the facility, would it make sense to say that every building is reviewed every 10 years? To ensure the appropriateness of the continued use of that facility name. And again, I'm not saying that's what it should be. I'm just asking the question. And then so my second sort of question / comment is on the buildings that have been named historically, and if no one here knows the answer to this question, that's perfectly okay, because I know that I'm asking some questions about buildings that have been around for a long, long time, or names have been used for a long time. But when we name, so I'll use David Hill, for example. I went to grade school there, right? Is there an archive that exists that kind of saves the thought process and or rationale behind how a building was named? I guess, I was using maybe an analogy that would make sense would be like whenever you drafted for a new law, one can always refer back to the legislative history around that law to kind of get some context, right? As to how
we have that. It's a publication called What's in a Name, and I'll have it sent to each of the board members, and it goes through the history of who like Leicester King was, what King School was named after.
Dr. James, I did already send that out to all of the board members earlier this year. I scanned it and sent it out. But if you need me to resend it, but if you
I took a look at that, but I think what I and I may have missed this, but I think what I didn't see in there was kind of the process that was followed. So I saw that it kind of gave you bios, if you will, of a lot of those folks in there. But what I didn't see was like this was the process that we use, to come up with this particular name for this particular building. That's what I didn't see. So if I missed that, my apologies. But
right.
But I saw what I thought was a lot of bios.
Yeah, most of those buildings, like the original David Hill was probably in the 1920s. I have never saw, like a rationale for that. I imagine at the time they just looked at, people who were influential in the community, like, how John Arbuckle, got named John Arbuckle or Harvey Firestone. So I'm assuming back in the days when those buildings were initially built, they used a process, I would imagine, that would be similar, historical significance for their contribution, to the community.
Yeah, that's basically what and Dr. James is right. The history is that these guys or these individuals were prominent people in the community who were running the big companies here, and they were giving a lot of contributions to the city, to the schools, to everyone. And since they were doing these things, and they made some historical, I want to say historical gains and some really good things that they really goals that they did to help the city and the school district, and they had their names put on the buildings. As Dr. James said, Buchtel, Litchfield, Firestone, Buchtel, all these schools had some individuals who were prominent in the city of Akron. There is some history, and Dave Liverbreth would have this. He is really good with all the history, and that's how I learned about a lot of it. I knew some, but I learned a lot through him, and he could give us a whole lot. And maybe Dr. James, we could, or Patrick, Mr. Bravo, we could look to him and ask him where could we get some of this so we can give a little bit more historical way back in the early 1900s when a lot of this stuff was going on.
Eric's point, I've never seen any of the process anywhere. I assume if anywhere, it would be in the minutes, if it's even in the minutes. But I know the bios are there, whether it's Auntie Case or, Resnick, Judith Resnick. I mean,
Right.
we know where all the names came from. I don't know the process behind it, but I think this is probably the first time, because I'll tell you, at least since the time Bruce and I have probably been on the board, and there haven't really been any building name changes, but there have, other than Kenmore Garfield, ostensibly, but whether it's a resource room or a field house or a field or something like that, it's really just been, there's no other name on it. The community, usually we don't know about it until the petition gets turned in. They get a petition together, they turn it in, there's a groundswell of community support, and they ask the board to name the resource room after, such and such person, and we consider it and we vote. But there hasn't been any deliberative process like this. This is the first time, that when we started this last year, this has been the first attempt, I think, at a really comprehensive naming policy. So I don't know if that process exists anywhere, Dr. Hall, other than maybe we could search the minutes.
Well, no, there's no need. There's no need. I just wanted to make sure I'd done my due diligence to make sure that there wasn't an older process that was followed 70 years ago or 50 years ago. That's all. So I think you guys have answered my questions appropriately. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else do we need to discuss in this part of the policy, Dr. James?
I don't think so. If you want, I can add some language in the administrative guidelines regarding background, information and research on a candidate, if we're going to do that for a name change.
The only thing I was going to say too is, like the background check, and then do we do like a community sort of comment period? So I know a lot of times on, a federal rule, there's like a comment period that might be 30 days where the community can comment. And we can kind of look at the comments because when I use the domestic violence example, you're not going to catch that in a background check, but it might come up as far as a community comments like, hey, did you know this guy, beat his wife, right, or abused his kids, and so that's something that obviously we want to know and be able to look into. So I would say if we could add language around that would allow for a 30-day or 45-day sort of community comment period, that might be helpful as well.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Okay. I don't think I'm missing anything else on the agenda. Am I missing anything, Dr. Akbar?
Well, the committee,
Oh, committee. Yes, I'm sorry.
yeah.
Yes.
But before we go there, just so that everyone is aware, the plan is to send the commemoration policy to the full board for third and final reading on Monday. So the background information seems to be the only thing needed to be added to the administrative guidelines. But the policy itself, it sounds like we're good with.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Does the comment period go in the administrative guidelines too? I like that.
Yep.
Yeah, we can put that in there as well.
Okay. And then next, the final thing we have is the committees. And Dr. James, you want to go ahead with that as well? Or is it?
I think this one was just really adding the equity committee. And then there was some language highlighted in red regarding, the process of those committees. Like I'll name a staff member to serve as a liaison, for that. I think I didn't really have any issues with it. I thought it was pretty straightforward. It does talk about, that the board can appoint ad hoc committees for specific problems or issues for a specific time frame when the need arises.
Yeah, so the policy basically, or the bylaws, basically a change to our bylaws to actually bring it more in line with the way we operate. The current bylaw is very slender. And so it doesn't name any of our committees or anything, or give us that authority, but it also doesn't give us, it doesn't prohibit us from having ad hoc committees and all of those things. So, or to say how many people are on each committee. So I think that it just clears that up and brings our bylaws aligned with the way we operate, while also adding the equity committee to that.
The only comment I had about, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr. Bravo.
I was just going to ask, the only question I have is, since we're having a discussion about it, is I've brought up to a couple of you before about maybe increasing the membership among committees so that there isn't such an issue of a quorum and a public meeting requirement. I mean, right now with 3 members on the committee, being 2 committee members and the president, anytime 2 people are having a discussion, hey, can you call me after work? I have a question about such and such. I mean, 2 people automatically constitute a quorum, and that phone conversation, however brief or whatever it may be on, by statute should be noticed. I mean, it's a committee of the board, and any prearranged discussion to discuss board business should be noticed. And that's not really what I think the spirit probably intends. But by having such a limited number of folks on each committee, we sort of put ourselves in that situation. And I'm just wondering if now might be the time, while we're talking about this policy, to take some time to talk about that and figure out if we want to restructure a little bit, or if we want to add more folks to each committee.
Well, so first, okay, so I have a question too that I want to get out there so that we, Mr. Alexander and Dr. Akbar can answer all of our questions. But my question was actually a minor point, and this language may have been in there, Dr. James, and I apologize if I missed it. But with the creation of an ad hoc committee, I know it's it probably makes, I would say it probably makes sense that if we're going to allow for the creation of ad hoc committees, that there would be an annual period of time in which we would review the need for the continuance of said ad hoc committee. So that way they don't, so basically what you're saying is an ad hoc committee cannot exist indefinitely. So every 60 days, there'd be a review of the continued need for the ad hoc committee's existence. That's the only thing I was gonna add. But I was interested in Mr. Bravo's question. Like, I was trying to think, Mr. Bravo, back to you. when you say add more people, like who are you thinking about adding? Because I know if we were to add more board members, then you have to notice it anyway because there's more board members. Now you have a quorum of the board. So I guess.
No, what I'm
That's
saying is, so right now, you add more board member. Our committee meetings have to be noticed anyway. Period. Any meeting of a committee or subcommittee of this board falls under sunshine law and must be noticed. So it doesn't matter whether we have 2 people or 12 people, it has to be noticed. But if I'm on this committee, if you and I are on the finance committee, along with the board president, and I say, hey, Derek, I really have a question on this. Can you call me after work today? And let's talk about this question I have on this subject that's part of finance committee. That phone call violates sunshine if it's not technically noticed as a meeting because there are so few people on that committee that it's a prearranged discussion to discuss board business. And so therefore it falls under sunshine. So it almost makes it impossible for even 2 of us to have a conversation outside of any publicly noticed setting. And I don't think that's fair. And we do have, I don't know, the occasional need to at least pick up the phone and say, hey, Derek, I didn't, that comment you made earlier in legal and board policy, I just had a question about that. And I don't want to have to notice a meeting to have that conversation. Not that I want anything to fall outside of sunshine, but it makes it fairly impractical, I think.
Is that actually sunshine? Because I thought, and I may be wrong, but I thought it had to be 3 or more people couldn't be together to do that. So if you and Dr. Hall were talking about something, that would be okay. If you're talking about the board information, or whatever, and then that would be okay because it's just the 2 of you. But I thought it had to be 3.
No,
Or
sunshine law says
could you be out in public together to do that?
sunshine law says a quorum, which is more than half. We establish a quorum of 50%.
Okay, so if I can interject here, I'm not a lawyer and I don't want to pretend to even play one on TV. But I did ask Diana Fido to look into this for us, and so she said, as you know, she just had a baby recently, so she's going to get that information to us shortly. So just wanted to say that I'm not sure if that affects this. Again, this is just going for first reading at the board meeting on December 14th. So we have time on this to fully discuss it. I don't even know if we need to fully discuss it today. But this was more so, this is the bylaw that is coming before us to have a full discussion at our next policy meeting.
Yeah, thank you. And I didn't need to derail us. That's why I was bringing it up since it's going for first reading. I just wanted to throw it out there that this might be the time to see if we want to add some more members to each committee.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you.
No problem.
It would be interesting to see what Diana has to say too, and maybe I need to go back and look at the sunshine piece again. Dust off my book and see what it's saying.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull it too. I mean, I'm gonna pull it too, and put my lawyer hat back on for that. Because I think the point that Mr. Bravo was getting at was, I think the distinction here, Mr. Alexander, I think the point he was making is like, well, whenever you have a quorum of a committee, so for example, a board meeting, that's 7 of us, so a quorum is basically 4. So in a committee meeting, if you only have 2 board members on the committee, if one talks to the other, that's a quorum because that's both committee members. I think that's the point he's making. It's a quorum of the committee, a quorum of the board members. If you say you're going to have 5 board members on that committee, if 2 of them talk, that's not a quorum. I think that's the distinction that he was going after.
Okay.
So, but again, yeah, but I think we all to be safe. I think we should, confer with our board counsel, and and again, I'll have a look at it again as well. But I think, Mr. Bravo, was that the point you were making? I just to make sure that I had that accurately represented.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that
Yeah.
makes sense then. Okay, all right.
And I still don't think that adding one person solves that problem, because here's the thing. if you talk to yourself, then that's 50%, you know. So if you talk to another person and it's 3 people, that's 67%. So that would be more than half. So the 3 people still doesn't solve it. So she's going to look into it and also look at case law and see if there's any rulings or anything that can glean some understanding specific to committees with no voting authority, not necessarily the full board. So that's what her and I chatted about. So hopefully we'll have that sometime next month before our next meeting.
Okay, great. That'll
I'll
be great.
follow up.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. James.
You're welcome.
Okay. Okay. Do we have any other questions in reference to this committee piece? Comments, concerns, questions? Okay. Anything else to come before this meeting?
No, I know Dr. James just fell off probably by accident. I don't think we have anything else, but just wanted to point that out to
Let's
you.
wait for him to come back. Okay. Okay, Dr. James, we just noted that we didn't have anything else to say or any other discussion. I didn't know if you had anything else at all. Okay, well, if not, that's all we have for this meeting. Meeting will be adjourned. Thank you to everyone who came and participated in the meeting. We appreciate your input.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And
Right.
we'll
Good
see
night, everyone.
everybody Monday.
All right.
Yes.
Bye, everybody.
All right.
All right. Good night.
Good night.
Everybody Monday.
All
All
right.
right.
Yes.
Bye, everybody.
All right.
All right. Good night.
Good night.